Hello, and welcome to the Week Unspun. This is a weekly live look in the world through the eyes of PR pros that would be asked from around the world. I'm Farzana Baduel here in London.
I'm Doug Downs in Western Canada.
Sorry, Doug, talked over you. I'm David, also in London.
And this week we have a special guest, Arun Sudhaman. Welcome, Arun. Where are you tuning in from?
I'm here in the UK, actually, so it's a very helpful time zone for me to finally make my Week Unspun debut. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Now, as usual, we have been looking at the week's news stories to discuss, among other things, and what has been going on, but with a PR lens. And for those who are watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, Instagram, please enter in your comments. We would love to hear from you. This week, we want to look at some headlines from the real world and what they mean. Now, we're going to be touching upon corporate layoffs and also the world of Omnicom and also Venezuela. And of course, as PRs, we're going to be talking about Edward Bernays. And first of all, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to talk about this special the Business Insider ran, and it's really an intricate look at some of the layoffs that are happening worldwide. If you're just listening, pause for a sec, have a look at your screen so you can see these roll by. Business Insider ran this feature this week looking at the major companies across tech, retail, finance, energy, transportation, consumer goods. So this is not just a tech thing, and no, it's not a tariffs thing, saying hundreds of thousands of employees earlier this year got notified about layoffs, or we know these layoffs are coming in 2026. And the main causes in each case that were listed are AI, reshaping workflows, automation, reducing the need for certain roles, the need to become, leaner, faster, that's ongoing, restructurings meant to prepare for an AI-driven environment. So, and according to the World Economic Forum, 41% of companies expect to shrink their workforces over the next 5 years because of AI. So for me, this really felt like a shot kind of across the bow. And I wanted to go to each of you and ask you from a comms standpoint, how should organizations be talking about large-scale layoffs in this era of automation, as well as are we at the point where we can consider this almost sci-fi feeling that for the first time in human history, messaging which is influential will not be just human to human, but maybe we're entering into an era where messaging will be computer influencing human. And what does that look like within the PR industry? Simple questions. I'll go to David first, just for the fun of it, and then bring in our guest. Yes.
Thanks for leading off with me. We talked about this a little bit when the Amazon story came out a few weeks ago, and the real story was that it was an AI story, but it was positioned as an efficiency story, and the markets rewarded them. So I think it's kind of a matter of what your orientation is. And if you are a employer brand, you probably have to think with a lot more sensitivity than maybe what we've seen. If you're a tech brand, if you are a consumer-facing, efficiency-driven brand, then maybe there's a different way to position these things. But I think what you're suggesting is that there's going to be a lot of companies and a lot of sectors that don't necessarily see themselves as efficiency-focused tech brands. They're going to have to think carefully about how they talk about their workforce and any reductions to the workforce. So I wasn't aware that some of those brands were making these types of reductions, but I think this is a wave that we should all be ready for.
Yeah. Arun, special guest.
Thank you, Doug. I think it's fascinating, actually, the stories that you showed us. And even in the professional services world, which we're all probably more familiar with, you are starting to see AI impacting jobs. And in particular, I saw a story this week about, I think it was salaries being frozen because of the impact of AI. I think there is a broader issue around how innovation is positioned, assuming we are comfortable classing AI within innovation. But there's been numerous research studies, including, for example, Edelman's Trust Barometer, which has found that the general public is often quite scared of the onset of these new technologies. And it's because of reasons like this, because of the job cuts that are often involved, the idea that they're being left behind by technologies and by innovations that will help companies make more money, but may not have them personally. So I think that's a challenge. We've also had this steady drumbeat of reports, whether it's World Economic Forum or elsewhere, talking about how 30% or 40% or whatever it is of jobs are going to be automated. So I think it creates a climate of fear. And I think business actually has a responsibility to demonstrate why things like AI will actually help us all, will help people, rather than necessarily just creating efficiencies that markets will reward.
I like the note about trust. I trust AI when I'm using it, but when anybody else is using AI, I don't trust it. It's a little bit like speeding on the highway or the freeway. It's okay if I'm doing it because I'm a superior driver, but other people, they need to stay within the speed limit. Farzana, your thoughts on the story?
I guess if you look at it from a corporate comms lens, you've got a number of different stakeholders. So if you're listed on the stock exchange, your stakeholder in terms of shareholder is probably responding quite positively. If you are thinking about your talent stakeholder, that is quite problematic because, as we all know, the research shows that talent does not thrive and operate well if there is no psychological safety. And so all of these conversations about AI replacing our jobs and the pace that this change is coming and impacting us is undermining the psychological safety. So I think that is definitely an area that the internal comms professionals will be really looking at in terms of how to create that sense of understanding what this actually means. And I think also what's quite helpful is to put it into context, because it's always quite scary when you feel it's the first time that's happening to society. But actually, if you look back and you look at the technology of books, the technology of cars, of radio, sort of TV, it did also decimate entire industries and sectors, but then it brought a whole load of new sort of sectors and industries. And I think the winners and the losers are really I think what differentiates the two is probably those who look at crisis the way that the Chinese have this double meaning for crisis, which is crisis and opportunity. So it's that where lies the opportunity. And I think the other thing that we can't really wrestle away from is the importance for the internal comms and the HR departments to really bring in this lifelong learning, that actually we are going to go through a lot of change, and those who lose their jobs or are predicted to lose their jobs in the next 12 to 18 months, they really need to start having that vocational training now and communicating that to them so that when the tide comes out, they're not sort of left standing. So I think big job for internal comms professionals in getting the workplace ready for these changes and to ensure that that psychological safety is still robust enough for the remaining talent in their jobs to actually maintain sort of momentum.
Yeah. And jobs are going to look differently. And David, I know in our next story, the jobs, the workforce is looking a bit differently with one deal having gone through.
Yeah, I want to come to that in just a moment. I just kind of want to respond to something that Farzana said, because we've had this conversation before about whether AI proposes fundamentally a risk or an opportunity. And both things can be true, but there's also kind of timeframes and immediacy. And I think for some people, it's going to feel like a crisis, especially if you're living paycheck to paycheck or you're worried about your next job. The fact that a whole new industry could be born in the next decade isn't that reassuring. And I think this could give way to a backlash. In fact, if I were going to make a prediction for 2026, I think we will see some sort of organic and then organized types of backlashes to this. How that gets expressed or where, I don't know, but that should be on almost any board's planning dashboard for next year. And I think there will be some organized negative reactions politically or otherwise.
Well, it's interesting you say that, David, because actually people do have a very negative reaction when they read ChatGPT generated content, say on LinkedIn, and they see, and it's really like a red rag to a bull, and people don't really sort of think about it in terms of critical thinking, saying, is it actually well written and is it clear and does it do its job in terms of communicating? As soon as they see the M dash, that is the signature, the fingerprints of AI, and that elicits a very negative reaction generally, which I think is actually quite interesting and probably I think lends itself to what you're saying, David. And again, if you look at history, every time you brought in these new technologies, you did have that sort of that pushback, but whether that pushback succeeded, I don't think history has showed that that you can ever stop the march of progress.
I think you're right. We could probably do a whole show on that. I just heard, I think it was on a podcast last week, someone said that anytime there's a fundamental shift to the communications architecture, it leads to revolutionary times. And sometimes there are unintended consequences to this. So it's kind of easy for us to look back and say the invention of the printing press spurred on a literate era, but it also it killed monarchies in most places. It ushered in an age of Protestant Reformation and ushered in kind of modern democracy. And that you might not say was a direct link, but it was definitely sort of a correlated set of things. I don't think we know what we're up against on the other side of these technological changes to the communications architecture. But moving on, and maybe there's a link here because I think it kind of popped up in my LinkedIn feed. Omnicom completed its long anticipated acquisition of IPG. I've seen this as a layoff story. That's what most of my LinkedIn feed seems to suggest. I guess there is a suggestion there might be an additional 4,000 layoffs in the combined group before the end of the year, holiday season for a lot of people. That's invited criticisms of the holding company model. A lot of questions about the brands, both at the advertising level and the PR level, what will survive, what should survive. And this is something that Arun and I have been discussing in different contexts for probably decades now. In a different life, Arun was asking me difficult probing questions about decisions that I was part of, or at least trying to help realize when I was part of one of the companies mentioned. And so I just got to ask Arun, what's your take? What are you hearing from the world on this, and what do you think we can expect next? And it's perfectly fair for you to throw that question right back at me, but since I'm talking, I'll ask you first.
It's very interesting, David, that you were so involved with Omnicom PR group brands at one point. So I think you probably have more insight than maybe you're letting on. It's, obviously with the completion of the acquisition, and then we finally had some clarity this week about what the agency roster would look like. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to talk about in terms of the advertising side, because we know now that BBDO and McCann and TBWA will be the remaining advertising brands in the merged entity. Sorry, it's not a merger. You must never call it a merger. It's a takeover of Interpublic by Omnicom. So that's useful to know. But if we're talking about the PR side, we're not really any the wiser so far, which is, I think, a little bit surprising for many people. We were expecting, including, I think, perhaps people within the bigger Omnicom group. I think everyone was expecting perhaps a little more clarity now. And it's tough, I think, that there's, layoffs have been announced, but there's not much clarity about where they will take place and how and who. There isn't really, I think, a huge amount, from what I understand, of internal communication. I know there was a town hall at Omnicom's PR firms this week, which I think is really good because I don't think that's happened at some of the other disciplines. We've seen that Omnicom leaders have largely taken on senior positions or the top positions at the new group. But in terms of what this means, I think that's also been lacking a little bit too. Beyond the integration of Flywheel and Axiom, which are the data assets, that seems like quite a forward-thinking move, which has some kind of strategic rationale to it.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there hasn't really been, I feel, much attention paid to why this why this takeover makes sense, and what solution it will provide.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I've heard officially, this is a data play, it's a tech play, and it puts the combined organization in a more competitive place, maybe a better bargaining space for, their real competition, which is going to be the big tech platforms. It makes them maybe attractive from a share point of view, but it hasn't made, in my mind, a compelling argument for clients yet. Nor has it made a compelling argument for talent. And back to our first story, I feel like that's kind of been by design. I mean, maybe the new entity is looking to position itself more as a tech-driven business than a talent-driven business. I'm sure I'll get a lot of criticism in my social media for saying that. I asked somebody at one of the PR companies, "What's the vibe?" I just asked this today. "What's the vibe right now?" And she said, "Well, we're in the hands of old American men. That's our fate." And I thought that was somewhat true, but honestly, that's probably always been true if you work for an Omnicom.
It's probably never been more true, I think, than at Omnicom today, unfortunately. I mean, there's a lot of angles to this. I think the lack of information around the PR side. I think John Wren gave an interview last week where he said he was very happy with his PR assets and there would be less disruption there, which is certainly, doesn't sound too negative, but also doesn't sound like there's a lot of attention being paid necessarily to that part of the ledger. And I think we're used to this now, that when anything happens in the holding group world, the implications for the PR firms are sometimes an afterthought. So I don't think that's especially surprising. But it's in a way the ultimate triumph of the accountants. I think it's really financial decisions made to benefit a financial vehicle. The benefits for staff and clients have not been, I think, been clearly argued at all, and I'm not sure they will be, and I'm not sure we should necessarily expect them to be. And then finally, the question I probably have that I think kind of lingers around this whole deal is, we seem to be moving into an era now where scale has never been less important in a way. Certainly for the public relations world. I'm not talking about advertising or technology or data. And I guess the question remains: if you're getting bigger at this time, what benefits specifically does it bring?
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to make a point, because I've tried to make this individually. People, I know there are humans who are worried about their jobs, who have already lost their jobs. So I don't want to make light of that. And I guess my message for anybody who finds themselves in that position or is worried about it, there is life outside of the Omnicom universe, and several of us have tried to demonstrate that. So I do want people to realize there is a different career path forward. And for those who are within, I think you'll probably have a pretty good career. I think Omnicom agencies do take care of their clients and will make investments where they should. I don't know what this says about Omnicom's commitment to PR, so we just have to take John Wren's word for it. Second point I want to make is these moves have a bigger impact on the rest of the industry than I think people who are not in these moves appreciate, because the big entities are the ones that end up acquiring or not acquiring startups. They set the rates for big enterprise level clients, and they shine a light on the markets that they think are important, and then by exclusion those that maybe aren't as important. So I do think it's the kind of thing that we need to follow, even if we're not in this business. I guess one question for you, Arun, and you and I have sparred on this, I think, before, but that's the importance of brands. And so, what, in your view, is the real value? What brand should fight to survive, and why? And if you don't want to name the brands, that's fine. But how valuable is a PR brand in this?
I think they should all fight to survive. I think brands are valuable, and even if they are combined together, the new brand is valuable. And I don't think anyone really wants to work for specifically a company or a vehicle that's kind of purely optimized for financial reporting. So I really do think brands are valuable, but the problem is, if you're looking at it from a holding company perspective, you can really, I think, quite easily see why some brands will be less valuable than others, especially when they're PR brands that are perhaps not quite as big as the advertising or data or media brands that are in your stable. Public relations, I'm just not convinced necessarily of the value of scale anymore. I feel like we are entering this kind of era where almost PR proceeds via more according to hand-to-hand combat, perhaps, rather than the kind of air wars we've seen from the past. And I think in that environment, small brands are actually really valuable. And what we're seeing in the market broadly is that small and mid-sized players, and particularly those that are maybe focused on one market or 2 or 3 sectors, are outperforming the market. We're certainly not seeing that in terms of the big networks.
Well, we could go on and on.
Yeah.
We've had this discussion before. I think it's hard to stand for scale without that being directly translated into efficiency, which has all the knock-on effects that we've been talking about, whether it's for headcount, whether it's for salaries, whether it's for investment. You become sort of it's a regression to the mean, or a lowest common denominator play if you're trying to bank on scale. So I do think there's an opportunity for brands to stand for something, whether they're part of Omnicom or not, but something of real value. And maybe that's, if there's an opportunity for any type of agency or firm to stand out, is to make sure their brands stand for something.
I like Arun seems to be saying agility is the new black. That's the feeling that I get from it. We have a couple of comments from Batman, I think, related to the layoffs there.
Yeah, let me bring it in. So we have
Bruce Wayne. I'm taking as Batman. This is the Batline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
So obviously AI has struck a chord, and we're getting comments on the AI piece. Of course, we are all nervous on some level. Very interesting. So he says, he believes something that would help us not replace ourselves is to really, self-evaluate ourselves. And he goes on to say, actually, we need a lot as humans. We need vacations, we need sick days, we need insurance, we show up late, we're a bit grumpy sometimes. We bring poor sportsmanship to the workplace and lunch breaks. We need a lot. And AI needs very little. And that is so true. So, yes, we should evaluate ourselves and benchmark us against AI. And then, of course, these jobs, sort of stacking shelves. We need to start the job at one cost, but we stay year after year, raise after raise, and then we end up driving costs up. The more we stay in a company, the more we expect from them, and we expect it to be sort of linear. And so how do we account for ourselves? And that's perhaps some weekend homework for all of you, is for us to do some self-reflection to figure out, actually, let's self-evaluate ourselves. Let's perhaps take a critical lens upon ourselves.
No, I would rather evaluate others. I don't want to evaluate.
Even better, get ChatGPT to actually self-evaluate. And you know what you could do? You could say to ChatGPT, do not give me your psychophantic response. Give me your raw opinion on my strengths, weaknesses, and what aspects of my life is going to be replaced by AI, and how can I make myself more competitive, and where are my risk areas? And remember to turn off ChatGPT's sort of psychophantic nature off, and then, trust me, have a stiff drink and then read the answer.
That's a great idea, Farzana. Let's all do that.
Yeah, sounds like a fun weekend ahead.
Reality check, anyone? Okay, now that leads me to my story. And I don't know an awful lot about South America, because unlike in North America, it's very dominant. You have and it's because I think two reasons. One is geographical proximity. US and Canada are on the doorstep of Latin America, and also the large diasporas that you have. And here in the UK, we just don't have that level of sort of diaspora. We don't have the geographical proximity. So Latin America is, it's very, it's a different world. But what's popped up is our producer, Solomon, earlier this week said to me, you should run the story on US-Venezuela. And of course we were saying, yeah, but actually I don't know much about it and what's happening. And, and obviously there's some sort of beef between the White House and this Latin American country, Venezuela. Here's Maduro. And I was trying to think, well, what's the PR lens on this? We can't just bring you stories without a PR lens. And of course, there is a PR lens. And now, if we look at the current story running, the US-Venezuela relations in 2025, it's a classic case of strategic framing and agenda setting. And, you're hearing allegations coming out about drugs and terrorism and democracy. And you're also hearing about the bogeyman, China, and also the bogeyman Russia, the othering of these other, big powers, these regional powers. And it's very much in the tradition of Edward Bernays' work with United Fruit. Now, for those who are interested in this, in the sort of slightly shady origins of PR, I would advocate that you watch a documentary on the BBC, and it's called The Century of the Self. It's actually available for free on YouTube. So if you Google BBC Century of the Self, it will come up, and it is, I think it's about 3 to 4 hours. Do have a look at it, and it unpacks actually what happened. And what's quite fascinating is what happened is that the US's relationship, or the White House relationship with Latin America, there is a playbook in place. And in the early 1950s, United Fruit hired Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, to rehabilitate its image and undermine Guatemala's elected government when land reforms threatened its holdings. So what did Bernays do? He orchestrated a campaign and he basically changed it from what it actually was, a commercial dispute between a corporate power and an elected government. And it actually turned it into a sort of conspiracy theory of communism taking root in Guatemala. And it wasn't the case. It was what we call in PR astroturfing. So what Edward Bernays did is he took a number of journalists, flew them out to carefully stage managed visits to round up the few communists hanging around at the time, and made it look to the journalists, because every single touch point was with a communist, that the country was about to fall to communists. And of course, you also had the othering of, the Soviet Union, and you had the same framing that you're seeing today with the US and Venezuela. And it resulted in actually normalizing and giving legitimacy to a CIA-backed coup, and as a defensive act, with United Fruit positioned as a responsible actor as opposed to a commercial spat. And so there lies in the parallels between Venezuela and Guatemala. And what has happened since the 1950s to now is actually you now have a fragmented media landscape. You have actually the ability for Venezuela to communicate back and set its sort of positioning, but you also have the ability for micro targeting. So what the US has also started to do is really link that spat with Venezuela in terms of what is a clear priority for the US at the moment, and that is illegal immigration, sort of rounding up the immigrants from Venezuela. And so you're seeing the similar playbook play out in real time. And I wanted to throw that, first of all, to our North Americans in the room. I will give it over to David first.
All right,
explain yourself.
I'll try to do this in 45 seconds. I think the parallels are that United Fruit was interested in protecting big plantations, and that the whole labor system depended on basically slave-run plantations. And I think that was the thing they were after. They said the threat was communism. I think in this case, what the Trump administration is actually after is oil, and I think they say the threat is drug cartels. I think the big difference is that Bernays could take some journalists to Venezuela, to Latin America, isolate the kind of stories they would have access to, and then that became the reality for American audiences. I think what we're seeing this time is that that's not possible. There's a lot of real-time checking, and the stories actually become about these so-called double tap strikes where the Defense Department, Pete Hegseth in particular, seem to be accused of either murder or war crimes for what they're doing. So that strategy, I think, was exactly the one they were trying to impose. I think its reality has been upended. And I don't think that the perception of Venezuela is the same in America's minds as perhaps the plantations were, or United Fruit's issues were, as part of the big Make Bananas popular campaign. Sorry, try to do that in 60 seconds.
Thank you, DG. Doug, have you got a minute?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Arun.
I was just going to say it is a similar playbook though, but yeah, over to Doug.
My takeaway was the comm strategy used here is just shorthand. That there's what President Trump is doing is trying to create a shorthand for Venezuela. In the same week, he's trying to do that for Somalia, calling people from Somalia garbage, the country garbage, because of things that are happening in Minnesota. I'll stay away from the political, but the shorthand drive as a comm strategy is so old and so common. It goes way back, further than Bernays. I see it right now with the Democrats calling Trump a fascist and a Nazi, just trying to create a shorthand for it. Trump didn't create this tactic. He's just the loudest mouth in the room right now. And that's why there's a focus on it.
And
where do we stand on Edward Bernays? I'm curious. Because he's kind of the so-called father of public relations. I must confess, I don't know a lot about him, but he's almost like a parent that the industry is now a little bit ashamed of.
You don't like Torches of Freedom? That was a great campaign.
I was just going to mention
women started smoking because of that than ever before.
Well, one of the great campaigns. I was going to mention Torches of Freedom. Yeah, I'm curious. I feel like maybe this industry's problem is this original sin.
It could be. We're lacking our own kind of mythical figures beyond him. And, that was 100 years ago, too. His whole manufacturing of consent, I think, sounded smart. Engineering of consent, sorry, sounded smart. Now it sounds quite manipulative, and I'm not sure it's the narrative that we want guiding our profession. But when you ask somebody who's the alternative, it's hard to come up with a name.
Yeah,
Mm.
I
Well,
like
I'm
that he
sure
brought.
future.
Sorry, I like
Sorry, go ahead.
the introduction of behavioral science to
Mm.
the approach, whether it was done at the time for the greater good or not. That I'm with you. But he did introduce some psychological principles, and that whole sales funnel, attention, interest, desire, action, that hasn't gone away. There's 14 steps now, according to Google, and we go back and forth through the funnel. But boy, the initiation of that funnel, brilliant concept.
I didn't know that was Bernays. I do know that we're out of time. So,
Oh, okay. All right. So time for the thank yous. As always, thanks to our producers, Emily Page, and this week, Solomon Ibeh. Solomon, I hope I'm saying your name right. David Olajidi, normally our producer, he's in Calgary. So I got to have a drink with him. And as soon as the Shova thanked Farzana this week on LinkedIn for coming to Prague for the Forum Media Conference, and Christina also offered this quote from Paul Holmes, which I thought was our great final thought. Quote, "If you're dealing with only one crisis today, you're very lucky." Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.